Well, welcome everybody. Before I start, let me first say that if you were not here last week, don't worry. Each one of these sessions, each one of these lectures is designed to be freestanding. Now, if you were here last week, I'll just from the outset, I want to point out that the topic this week versus last week, even though both are talking about Jewish spies, there is obviously a very big difference. What we didn't have last week, even last week when we spoke about Mo Berg, there's historical debate about him, but there's not a lot in the way of controversy. Mo Berg was spying for the United States, as opposed to the Rosenbergs, as we'll see, were spying against the United States. Mo Berg was never brought on trial, and the Rosenbergs were convicted, tried, and ultimately executed for being spies. So there's more controversy associated with it. And as we'll also see this evening, there are deeper political implications about the Rosenberg trial. I would say implications that reverberate all the way until the present. If there's one thing the Rosenberg trial teaches us, not only in the 1950s when it took place, but even in 2022, is that, as we'll see, there's an element in this story which is conspiratorial in nature. It resonates with a notion of a Jewish conspiracy that I'll explain in a few minutes. And I just want to, just in case I forget to tell you this, it's an illustration that whatever the conspiracy theory is, even if it doesn't start as a Jewish conspiracy theory, all conspiracy theories eventually become Jewish conspiracy theories. The Rosenberg is a great example, and that's not only a message for then, that's even right now. Every conspiracy theory percolating around in our country, elsewhere in the world, even if it doesn't start with Jews, it's going to be about Jews eventually, which means whatever attitude toward a particular conspiracy theory, however your own outlook or politics jibes or doesn't jibes, when you hear a conspiracy theory, regardless of what it is, you should automatically become suspicious, you should automatically become wary, and you should resist it, because by definition, conspiracy theories tend to be not true, and secondly, conspiracy theories never work out well for Jews, ever, partly because, and this is really the subject of a different talk, the original conspiracy theory was a Jewish conspiracy theory. That this age-old notion that Jews conspired with the devil to kill Christ, that's the original conspiracy theory, and one of the most tenacious. Okay, that's my little PSA announcement. Well, I guess I'll just say one other thing. Allow me one other thing before we begin in earnest. That there's a lot going on in our country right now. I mean, it's been troubling in certain ways, especially Supreme Court decisions, and that's really the subject of something. It's a totally different talk. The one thing I will say, and again, regardless of what your politics are, the one thing to glean from these three Supreme Court decisions that were handed down this week is all three: a woman's right to choose, relaxing laws about gun regulation, and of course, allotting money for public schools. All of these reflect a growing Christian influence on American politics. And here I'll hand you another conclusion from our history is, and this is, I can't think of a single exception to what I'm about to say. The more Christian a country gets, the less tolerant it is, and that never works out well for Jews. If you can think of an exception to that rule, I would be happy to hear it. But I've been racking my brains hoping there was one. There isn't. It's not in the best interest of Jews for our country to become more, let's say, Christian influenced, for separation of religion and state to be eroded. Never a good thing for us. Okay, so ends my PSA for the evening. Thank you for listening. Now we can begin in earnest. So this evening we're going to talk about two Jewish spies, probably the two most well-known, infamous, notorious Jewish spies in American Jewish history. This is Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So let me tell you the short version of the story first, and then we can talk at greater length about the longer version, the full version of the story. The short version of the story is Julius and Ethel Rosenberg they were second-generation American Jews who, in 1950, were, as I mentioned, arrested, tried, and convicted of treason against the United States, the charge being selling military secrets and even atomic secrets to the Soviet Union, and eventually they were executed in 1953. Now there are two salient facts that I have to point out from the beginning. I'm going to point them out now and then return to them at the end. We can reflect on them a little bit, get a little perspective on them. The first is, keeping in mind that the whole ordeal with the Rosenbergs took place at the height of McCarthyism, when in the 1950s, when, I wasn't alive then. It was a little bit before I was born. I don't remember it personally, but what I've heard and what I've read, it seemed like our country just was losing its mind. It was a kind of insanity that was pervading the country, this hunt for communists, and this avid and this rabid pursuit of communists. It ruined a lot of people's lives. It ultimately didn't accomplish very much. But what's interesting is, for all that McCarthyism, there were only two individuals who were executed for being communists: Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. So one question we need to think about is that just a coincidence? Or was it not a coincidence that the only two communists who were executed were Jews? And the flip side of that question, and I think this is as or more compelling, is that, think about it. At the height of McCarthyism, two Jews were convicted of being communists, and there wasn't very much in the way of a backlash. If that happened 20 or 30 years earlier in the United States, there might have been a pogrom against Jews or some kind of riot against Jews. If that happened now, when a minority group was convicted of treason, there would be violence in the streets, and yet in the aftermath of the Rosenbergs, it simply didn't happen. The contrast here, the contrast in terms of comparing it to another trial, is the Dreyfus Trial. Because remember, the Dreyfus Trial, which took place in France in the 1890s, Dreyfus was a Jewish soldier in the French army who was convicted of treason, and when he was publicly sentenced in Paris, it wasn't just that the crowd began to yell, "Death to the Jews," but riots against Jews broke out all over France. And when the Rosenbergs were convicted, well, yes, this was a big deal, but no riots. No, there wasn't some mass rioting against Jews. Small protests only. That's very different. And intuitively, we would have expected the impact of the Rosenberg trial to have something more along the lines of the Dreyfus trial. So one of the questions we can try to ask at the end is, why the difference? Why the difference? Okay, so I want to put those two things out there, and I'll come back to them at the end. All right. So let's go from the short version of the story to the longer version of the story. And this is a complex story. There's a lot of moving pieces in this story. I think the place to start, really, is by clarifying a stereotype, by making sure it's clear to you a particular stereotype about Jews, and that's the notion that, a stereotype which claims that all Jews are communists, all communists are Jews. Now, we don't hear that as much today, but once upon a time, that was a very pervading stereotype. In this country, this notion that Jews were somehow not only a threat, but the threat. Let me give you an example of how deep this perception ran in the middle of the 20th century. During the Second World War, I think it was in 1942 or 1944, a survey was conducted. A poll was conducted. Americans were surveyed, and they were asked, remember, this is in the middle of World War II, when the United States was at war with Nazi Germany and Japan. And Americans were surveyed, and they were asked, who poses the greatest threat to America? On that list, who poses the greatest threat? Germany was number 3. Japan was number 2, 40% or more. I think it was 44% of Americans surveyed said the greatest threat to America is Jews. In 1944, when we were at war with 2 countries, not the country that attacked Pearl Harbor, not Hitler, who was threatening to take over the world, Jews. So this notion of Jews being communists resonated with a deeper fear of Jews, which we call Judeophobia. Now, this phenomenon of Judeophobia goes back a long way. It goes back centuries. It manifested first in religious terms, and then later in racial terms. By the turn of the 20th century, it had also taken on a political dimension. And really, there's actually a moment, mid-19th century, where we have the beginnings of the crystallization of this stereotype about Jews. See, in 1840, I'll make a long story short, there were revolutions in 1848 in Central Europe, basically trying to recreate in Central Europe what had happened in Paris in 1789 in the French Revolution. These were liberal revolutions. Now, in 1848, liberal was very radical. Liberal is not as radical as communism would later be, or socialism would later be, but in 1848, to be liberal was to be the quintessential radical advocate of change. Now, in these revolutions, the largest of these revolutions took place in Vienna and was led by a nice Jewish doctor from Budapest whose name was Adolf Fischhoff. He was the leader of the largest of these revolutions, and because of that, there emerged a stereotype that all revolutionaries are Jews, and all Jews are revolutionaries. A stereotype that came out of 1848. But there's more to the story. Those revolutions were defeated, and the reason those revolutions were defeated is because the powers that be were able to muster armies and defeat them by 1850, and that was made possible largely by the funding and support of a single Jewish family, the Rothschilds. Now, because of that, a second stereotype emerged from these revolutions, namely that all Jews are counter-revolutionary, all Jews are conservative, all Jews are reactionary, all Jews are anti-liberal. So, from 1850 on, wherever you were on the political spectrum, if you didn't like Jews, you had a political reason or a political justification to explain it. If you were someone on the right, all Jews are Fischhoff, all Jews are revolutionary. If you were someone on the left, all Jews are Rothschilds, they're evil capitalists. And by the time we get to the 20th century, that notion of all Jews are revolutionary had expanded to include notions like all Jews are progressive, all Jews are socialist, and then of course all Jews are communist, all Jews are Bolsheviks, and the converse of all these statements. All progressives are Jews, all socialists are Jews, all communists are Jews, all Bolsheviks are Jews. So by the time we get to the 20th century, this notion of all Jews are communists and all communists are Jews, it was pretty pervasive in the United States, no less than in Europe or in any other part of the world. Keeping in mind, at the conclusion of the First World War, there were 3 communist revolutions in Europe, the largest of which was successful, the Russian Revolution. Communism became something that was very frightening, and it was very frightening to Americans as well. There was a moment, not a very long moment here, but there was a moment when it seemed like communism might make some actual inroads in the United States. If you saw I can't remember if it's Oscar-nominated or Oscar-winning film, Reds, with Warren Beatty and Diane Keaton and Jack Nicholson, great movie. Such a long movie. Who would ever sit for a 4-hour movie anymore? But that was based on the story of Jack Reed, an American communist. Not Jewish, by the way, but there were a lot of people who assumed he was Jewish because he was a communist. Communism was frightening. In fact, calling someone a communist in, let's say, 1920 or even 1930, you were basically describing them as the most frightening person in the world, because communism wasn't only politics. Communism was upheaval and revolution and violence, even though that's not what most communists were. When people thought of communists, they didn't think of someone on a kibbutz which is largely nonviolent in nature. They thought of the Soviet Union, and after a certain point, to be communist meant to be Stalin. Now, Stalin, by the time we get to the Second World War, Stalin was miles away from being a communist. He was an authoritarian. He was totalitarian. He used communist rhetoric to make possible an authoritarian country. Okay, but none of that mattered, because for most people, the notion of someone being communist was terrifying. I would say there's a parallel between, in 1920, saying all Jews are communists and all communists are Jews. The parallel frightening statement now would be all Muslims are terrorists and all terrorists are Muslims, because in 1920 a communist then was as frightening as a terrorist is now. So the point is terrifying. But there were, for a lot of people, to be communist didn't mean violent upheaval. You know, if you're going to be able to really follow the nuances of the life and the experience of the Rothschilds, of the Rosenbergs, what you're going to have to unglue yourself from is a notion that percolates these days, that everyone who leans left is liberal, progressive, socialist, communist, like those things are all the same. They're not. Those things are all very different. There were liberals, and still are, who are anti-communist and anti-socialist and even progressives. Those are all separate, distinct political outlooks. And there were communists who were 100% communist, but were against violence, against violent revolution, and they were opponents and critics of Stalin and the Soviet Union. So to be a communist didn't mean you were a lover of Stalin. Maybe it did at the very beginning, but the moment that Stalin revealed his hand as someone violent, the minute the purges started, the communists outside the Soviet Union began to abandon him, the Rosenbergs included. Okay? But the point is, the Rosenbergs were reared at a time when, there was this stereotype about Jews being communists, but there also were Jews, like other people, who embraced these various movements. There were Jewish communists in America. There were also Christian communists in America. The communist movement, the Communist Party, though never very large, and in retrospect, never really posed any kind of real threat. The threat that McCarthy imagined was never anywhere near reality. But people really believed it. And not just, and not just crazy people or marginal people. It's interesting to note at the outset of the Rosenberg trial, what President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was president in the 1950s, look at your handout, look at text number 1. Look what he said about the Rosenbergs. He said, quote, "By immeasurably increasing the chance of atomic war, the Rosenbergs may have condemned to death tens of millions of people all over the world." That's a lot of responsibility to place on the shoulders of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Now, the flip side to that, the very different attitude, listen was the almost sense of bewilderment that Julius and especially Ethel Rosenberg felt during this whole ordeal. Look what Ethel Rosenberg said. This was during the course of her trial. She said, "The great democratic United States is proposing the savage destruction of a small, unoffending Jewish family. The Rosenbergs will be the first victims of American fascism." What's very interesting is her criticism about the way the United States government handled the charge of the Rosenbergs is very similar to the criticisms that were made of the Dreyfus Trial. Okay, so we have these two very different understandings. Let's talk a little bit about the world that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg grew up in and how it is they got into this situation. How did they get into this mess? They were both the children of immigrants. They were both part of working class Jewish families. Ethel was 3 years older than Ethel was born in 1915. Julius was born in 1918. Julius, like much of his generation, he went to high school, he went to college, eventually he was trained in the sciences, and he served as part of the Signal Corps in the Second World War. Ethel Rosenberg, she finished high school. She had planned to go to college, but then she decided not to. She opted for the more traditional, let's call it the more traditional American course for path for a woman in the 1920s, 1930s. She wanted to raise a family instead. She went a different way. Okay. Now, in terms of their politics, Julius was clearly more active in the Communist Party. By 1920, Julius Rosenberg was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party in the United States. That's a phrase that would come up again and again, especially during the McCarthy trials. But here we have to be very clear, because to be a card-carrying member of the Communist Party didn't mean the same thing in every case. I'll put you this way. A communist, you could be a card-carrying member of the Communist Party if you went to a meeting and signed your name on a list that you were there. You could be a card-carrying member of the Communist Party if you subscribed to a newspaper that was regarded as being left-wing or communist. I know, and I don't think I'm giving away any secrets here. I know my dad, he subscribed to the New Republic in the 1950s, and in the 1950s, the New Republic was pretty left-wing. So if that's kind of purge right now, he was on this subscription list. I subscribe to it too. So, reading the New Republic might make you culpable. So just being a card-carrying member in and of itself didn't necessarily mean anything. And there were a lot of card-carrying members for whom being a card-carrying member of the Communist Party was like being a card-carrying member of the JCC. It doesn't mean, yes, I swim there. That's all it really means. It doesn't reflect anything political necessarily. And there were instances where people would just go to a party, go to a gathering. There were students who became card-carrying members just to get the free meal. And they eventually were seen as card-carrying members. Julius went beyond that. He was a communist. He believed it. He was active in party activity. Now, Ethel wasn't as active. She gravitated more in the direction of being more domestic. But what the two of them both agreed on, and Julius was more outspoken, is they shared a working class critique of American society and American liberalism. They believe that, the country has made these strides, the country has improved in certain ways, more people have gotten access, people have made more money, there has been some successes, but lower income and working class people have not benefited very much from these improvements. They were critical of not only American society, but even though they were critical of those who claimed to be bettering American society. And of course, they were especially critical about the wealthy elite whom they believed were hoarding all the wealth for themselves. Julius believed this even before the Great Depression hit. But he was among those who, even by the end of the 1920s, he was recognizing some of the recklessness taking place in the financial world, in the wealthy elite of American society, and he was someone for whom, actually we might say both of them were individuals for whom the Great Depression and the crash of the economy, insofar as it had a much more profound and negative impact on lower income and working class people, that it just, in their mind, it magnified the disparity between rich and poor. And they had a vision of what America was supposed to be, and in their mind, what America had become by the 1930s and the 1940s was no longer what America was supposed to be. There simply were too many people being left out. And if you hear echoes of the same thing, that the same complaint you hear today, it's because the situations are actually not that different. But the Rosenbergs, in embracing communism, They weren't doing it to be un-American or to challenge America or because they hated America. They did it, and they were very clear when they wrote about it. And they were very clear when they spoke about it. They did it because they loved their country. They loved America, and they wanted to make it better. They saw themselves in the image of earlier Americans who had made changes for the good, and they wanted to be part of that trajectory and that arc of change, and they felt that their country was heading in the wrong direction, and they wanted to fix it. That's what it meant to them to be communist. Okay? Now, here's where the story gets a little more complicated, and here's where the path of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg begin to diverge. That's as far as Ethel Rosenberg went. That's all she did. Julius was a little more intense. He was a little bit more fanatic about it. And, well, by the middle of the Second World War, Julius had enlisted. He was, like I said, he was part of the Signal Corps. And Signal Corps is another word for the communications part of the Army. They dealt with various communication and technology issues in the Army. And remember, for much of the war, the United States was allied with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was neutral in 1939, but then when the Soviet Union was invaded by Hitler in June of 1941, Stalin allied with Churchill and Roosevelt. The Soviet Union allied with the Allies, and they remained allied all the way until the end. Really, it's not until 1945 when these tensions between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union began to appear. If you ever saw the movie Patton was one of those who suspected it, and that post-war problem had its roots, but only at the very end of the war. The Soviet Union was an ally. And so, a member of the American military helping the Soviet Union until a certain point in the war wasn't exactly treason. It was more like, maybe this ally can have, with its own organization, with its much vaster, let's say, social service network, the way it does a better job taking care of poor people. And believe me, I'm not forgiving all the problems with the Soviet Union. But from the vantage point of someone who was a communist, who felt there were shortcomings and problems in the United States, the Soviet system actually made sense in certain ways. And so even though there was an official policy in the State Department and in the Signal Corps not to give information to the Soviet Union, they were an ally, but they were an arm's length ally, it wasn't exactly giving information to the enemy. Because beyond that, remember, they were fighting with the United States against Hitler and fascism. Okay, so that's where the story gets a little bit complicated. Because initially, in the mind of Julius Rosenberg, the Soviet Union was not the enemy. Stalin was not Hitler. He eventually became Hitler, but he wasn't clear that he was going to be. Now, it was during the course of the war that Julius Rosenberg was recruited to secure and pass along classified information, particularly about, in the Signal Corps, about certain information technology, sensors, and we don't have to get bogged down in the technicalities of it. But then he eventually was approached also to give information about the Manhattan Project and the atomic energy program. Now, Julius Rosenberg didn't know very much about that. He wasn't involved in the Manhattan Project. He wasn't in New Mexico. He was on the East Coast. He knew about information and communication, and that's what he knew about. But the key individual there was Ethel's brother, whose name was David Greenglass. Now, David Greenglass, he worked in the Manhattan Project, developing an atomic bomb. And he was approached by foreign agents to secure information, and eventually was accused of giving this information to the Soviet Union. Now that is very, very serious. And at the conclusion of the war, really at the end of the 1940s, when the dust settled and the Iron Curtain came down, and suddenly there were these tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, suddenly there was this issue of, suddenly the Soviet Union was the enemy, And there were concerns that during the war and in the immediate aftermath of the war, there had been leaks. Information had been given to the Soviet Union. They didn't have any specific information until at the end of the 1940s, a man whose name was Klaus Fuchs, who was a British operative. He was caught selling classified information to the Soviet Union. Now this is right at the very beginning of the anti-communist purge in this country. So we're not talking about full-fledged or full-flowered McCarthyism yet. Right now they were just trying to catch spies. But you know what happened? Klaus Fuchs was caught and arrested, and he did what many who were arrested did. He cut a deal. He said, will you shorten my sentence if I give you a few more names? And he gave up some names. Now, in this instance, he wasn't giving up false names. He wasn't handing over innocent people. The two key names he gave, one was a man whose name was Alexander Feklisov, who was a Soviet agent operating in Great Britain and the United States. The other person he gave up, the other person he pointed the investigators to, was David Greenglass, Ethel Rosenberg's brother. And he and his wife, Ruth Greenglass, they were arrested also on crimes of treason. Now, Ruth Greenglass didn't really have anything to do with this. And at this point, David Greenglass knew he had no chance here. He was caught red-handed, so to speak, and, Red Scare, red-handed. He knew he was caught. What he tried to do more than anything else is to keep his wife out of it. So the deal he made with the prosecutors and those who were bringing him to trial, bringing him to justice, he said, I'll give you up some more names if you leave my wife Ruth out of it. That's what he wanted to do. He eventually had to serve 14 years. He did a pretty good job keeping her out of it. And he gave up a number of names, including, he said, well, if you really want to investigate someone, you should investigate my sister and brother-in-law, Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. Those are those moments when, look, I've never been in that situation. I've never had to choose between facing a lifetime in prison or worse versus handing over one of my siblings and spouse. And I would hope that I wouldn't do it, but I can't. I'd love to be able to say for sure, but sometimes my siblings really annoy me, and I might just hand them over. I don't know. But the point is, he did to cut his sentence. He cut a deal, and this is when the investigation was shined on Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And here's the point where the very fact that Julius Rosenberg was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party, this was a point when, in the eyes of at least some of the prosecutors and the investigators, he was automatically and immediately presumed guilty. Because he's a communist. Of course he's doing that. See, this when we transition in to the mentality of McCarthyism overwhelming what might have been an ordinary investigation, just a military investigation, things accelerated and intensified and deepened very quickly. So Julius Rosenberg was immediately presumed to be guilty, even though they really didn't find a whole lot of specific evidence. They never really found much evidence, much concrete evidence. A lot of it was circumstantial. A lot of it was the uncorroborated testimony of those who were handing him over, especially Alexander Feklisov and his brother-in-law. But they didn't have the smoking gun. They didn't have the document. But it didn't matter. Because the Rosenbergs were arrested in 1950, and by the time they came to trial, think about the early 1950s in this country. First of all, a war had broken out in Korea, which was a war seen as democracy versus communism. The Soviet Union had actually developed and tested a nuclear weapon. So this was really intensifying the situation. And as this anti-communist purge began to intensify, Julius Rosenberg and Ethel Rosenberg, they were already front and center. They were already right in the crosshairs from the beginning. Now they weren't the only ones. By this point, Alger Hiss had already been arrested. There were already questionable individuals in the army. This is the point when the entire Hollywood industry and media were coming under suspicion. But in many ways, the Rosenbergs, I mean, they were a perfect example of just the spies you want to catch. Because Julius worked in the army, and he worked with confidential information. They were connected to David Greenglass. But of course, the big question, and really the question that pervades this is, did it matter that they were Jewish or not? Now, we have no specific evidence to suggest if they had been Julius and Ethel Fitzpatrick, it would have been different. We don't know. But I have to imagine, I think it's reasonable to say, the very least, the fact that they were Jewish didn't help. If nothing else, the fact that they were Rosenbergs affirmed that stereotype, affirmed that pervasive belief that Jews and communists, to be Jewish, to be communist, was inseparable. It just made it easier to proceed. You know, it smoothed out some of the friction, some of the resistance. I don't know what other metaphor to use. It made bringing them to trial more downstream than upstream. Maybe that's the best way to put it. It didn't cause it, but it sure seemed like it facilitated it. And I think that's also evidenced by the fact that when the Rosenbergs were arrested and brought to trial, their trial did become a national issue. It was a national event. I mean, newspapers all over the country were talking about it. I think I'm going to give you a couple of examples about how newspapers reported. Now, as you can imagine, newspapers that were more conservative, more right-wing, and tended along the lines, for them the mantra was very simple. You know, they're communists, and we're hunting down communists, and look, we found some communists, just like Senator McCarthy said we would. Boom, we've got some communists, all right? But there also were those who were defending Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and they weren't defending, they weren't dwelling on did they do it or didn't they do it, but the larger implications of what it means to bring to convict two individuals who are innocent. We have to be sure that they're guilty, otherwise this becomes a witch trial. So look at text number 3. This was an essay written in a publication called The National Guardian in 1951. This is a year or a year and a half after the Rosenbergs were arrested, as they're coming to trial, as the trial's beginning to proceed. And they're going to draw a direct comparison between the trial of the Rosenbergs for treason, as spies guilty of treason, versus Dreyfus as a spy guilty of treason. So the essay was called "The Rosenberg Conviction, Is This a Dreyfus Case of Cold War America?" It's one of those great titles which tells you exactly what's going to be in it. Quote, here's an excerpt. Is the Rosenberg case the Dreyfus case of Cold War America? Is it Sacco and Vanzetti case of this era? Sacco and Vanzetti were two anarchists, /socialists who were arrested in 1920 for sedition against the United States. Is it the Sacco and Vanzetti case of this era when the nightmare Truman war program demands the destruction of militant labor opposition? In other words, is President Truman using the conviction of two communists for treason as a way to undermine labor unions or militant left-wing individuals? Is it the Reichstag fire trial? The Reichstag fire was a fire that was set, the German parliament, the Reichstag, was burned down in 1933. Eventually two left-wingers were brought to justice, even though later it turned out that the Gestapo did it to sort of stage the whole thing. But it was a way to discredit the political left in Nazi Germany. Is it the Reichstag fire trial of a time when the voice of protest from the political left must at all costs be silenced? Of these aspects of the political background of the Rosenberg trial, there is no legal doubt. Legal justification of the thesis that all communists that is, in ultimate effect, all advocates of socialism and or peace are traitors, knowing only loyalty to the Kremlin is being sought by the government by every means. This is a claim that the arrest of the Rosenbergs is simply a ploy to discredit the political left in America. Remember, this is the point of view of one newspaper, okay? But it is a powerful point of view. This is the contention of the McCarran Act, which was passed several decades earlier, and the basis for its provisions and political repression, the possibility of removing all constitutional checks on the hounding of left-wing Americans depends on the government's ability to convince the public that all such persons are a, quote, real and present danger, unquote, to national security. Upholding of the conviction of the Rosenbergs would go far toward enabling the government to make any member of any of the 200-odd organizations officially labeled subversive subject to arrest as a spy. In other words, this is the claim that the whole trial is simply a show trial. It's simply a way to discredit anyone who leans to the left politically in any way, anyone who was a peace activist during the war, anyone who opposes the involvement of the United States in Korea. All those people can simply be silenced and hounded and their constitutional rights cast aside. Now that's what they believed, this opinion believed that the Rosenberg trial was about. But, he goes on, submerged beneath the four-ring circus of the Rosenberg trial, with its sensationalized press treatment of atom bomb sketches, jello box tops, which was, believe it or not, part of the evidence against Ethel Rosenberg, and cloak and dagger melodrama emanating from the confessed spies Harry Gold and Elizabeth Bentley, were such sober facts as these. Not an iota of documentary evidence to support or corroborate the government's charges was produced. The only two government exhibits put in evidence directly linked to the Rosenbergs are a Spanish refugee appeal collection can found in their apartment and a nominating petition for the late Peter Cacchione, New York Communist Party councilman candidate, signed by Ethel Rosenberg in 1941. That's the closest they found to actual explicit, non-circumstantial evidence against the two. The witnesses on whom the government's whole case was founded are two confessed spies. One went scot-free, the other will be eligible for parole on his jail term in 8 years. And a man who calls himself a liar on the witness stand and has said he had been continuously scared to death since falsifying a government loyalty oath in 1948. In other words, the witnesses aren't credible. The Rosenbergs are outspoken radicals. Here's an interesting twist. Let me just explain before I read this. What's different between when the Rosenbergs were brought to trial and others convicted is others immediately, the general trend when someone was brought either to actual trial or to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee being accused of a communist was just to capitulate. Maybe a quick denial followed by, I want to cooperate. What the Rosenbergs did during their trial was very striking. At no point did they apologize for any of it. They said, yes, well, Julius certainly, yes, I'm a communist. And I'm a communist not because I hate America, but because I love America and I'm trying to help and I'm trying to save America. That's what he believed in his mind. That's what he believed he was doing. And this was different than others who were brought to trial. They weren't saying, oh, I really regret what I did. I didn't mean to do harm. He didn't believe he was doing any harm. Okay? The Rosenbergs are outspoken radicals in striking contrast to all of the confessed conspirators. What do all these things add up to? We leave it to each reader to judge of that for himself as the story unfolds in these pages. And to each we leave judgment of what is implied in this case for every American voice hereafter, speaking up for American principles, unquote. Meaning that what this essay is saying is that the conviction of the Rosenbergs, not cut and dry. The evidence, not overwhelming, not compelling. A lot of it is circumstantial. A lot of it a lot of the conviction was fortified by the fact that they were that they were card-carrying members. But there wasn't any actual evidence. In other words, the editors of the National Guardian, they're suspecting a conspiracy going on here. They're suspecting that the Rosenbergs are being used as foils. They're being scapegoated to discredit the American left. Okay? That's one. That's one point of view. Now, that probably was true in the case of Ethel Rosenberg. Ethel Rosenberg, the main thing she was accused of doing, and this is something that even subsequently historians, when they have pored over all accounts, the main thing she was accused of doing is typing up a report for Julius Rosenberg. He had a report, he had some information he wanted to pass along to foreign operatives. She was a better typist, she typed it up. That's it. So maybe she helped him a little bit. But her involvement, there's no question. She was not involved. He maybe was involved. All right. But I think the trial and the conviction and the lengthy appeal, it began to reverberate into a broader debate about what the significance was it means, what it meant. Here's an essay that appeared in a magazine called Jewish Life, okay, in May of 1952. Now, the essay is going to use a very charged word. The word Judenrat. Judenrat means Jewish council, and Judenrat is the term that was used by in Nazi ghettos, where the Jews in each ghetto were invited to create a Jewish council to supervise the ghetto. That was known as the Judenrat. After the war, and even to this day, Judenrat does not, and this will be an understatement, does not have a very positive connotation. Judenrat is not a neutral word meaning Jewish council. Judenrat has a very powerful element of collaboration. Okay. The Rise of an American Judenrat. That's the title. This is another analysis of the Rosenberg trial. Quote, this is text number 4. The Judenrat in the ghettos was created, as the German title implies, by the Nazis to further their interests in the Jewish community. In other words, here's the claim that the Nazis created the Judenrat, and a Judenrat in each ghetto to make it easier to organize and deport all the Jews and to kill all the Jews in the ghetto. That's the claim. Incidentally, just by the way, historians of the Judenrat have found out that it's not quite that simple. That's why they were originally formed. That's not exactly what they did. Okay, but that's neither here nor there. For the point of this essay, Judenrat means a way of basically facilitating an insidious aim. Under present conditions in our country, pro-fascist reaction is not yet capable of appointing Jewish Gauleiters on a broad scale. Gauleiter in German means regional leaders or sectional leaders, okay, district leaders. Appointing Jewish Gauleiters on a broad scale. However, we are witnessing a new development, different from the ghetto Judenrat, in that Jewish leaders are themselves assuming the function of the Judenrat, serving the interests of growing fascism as agents within the Jewish community. What they're referring to is not specifically the trial itself, but the response of American Jews, and especially American Jewish organizations and leadership to the Rosenberg trial. Now let's not underestimate it. For American Jews, and especially for prominent American Jewish organizations and institutions, this is a tough moment. Because remember, this took place in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and World War II was a great moment of solidarity between American Jewry and American society. World War II was a crucial moment where American Jews in large numbers got to demonstrate their unfailing patriotism and loyalty to the United States. I think most visibly in terms of actual military service. Thousands of Jewish soldiers served, fought, died, but also in many other ways, just being supportive, whole cloth supportive of the war effort, the war against Hitler, the war against fascism. And after the war, most of American Jewry was very much on the side of the United States in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Okay? So this is a moment when two Jews brought to trial. What are American Jewish organizations going to do? They can't. You can't simply abandon or pretend like this has nothing to. There's no connection here. They're American Jews. What does it mean for this notion of loyalty and patriotism? Now, for some American Jewish organizations, it was easier. You know, the American Jewish Committee is a more conservative organization. They're the publishers of Commentary Magazine. They simply said they affirmed the verdict. They were spies. These are left-wing Jews. They deserve it. And in many ways, in some fashion or another, much of American Jewry went along with it. But there's also this concern about what the implications of this was going to be for other American Jews. Is this going to lead to the questioning of the loyalty of all American Jews? This is what I mean by the aftermath. There was an expectation in 1952 and 1953 that the aftermath of the Rosenberg trial could be something like the aftermath of the Dreyfus Trial. And American Jewish organizations were very quick to stand up and say, we don't condone this. We don't condone what the Rosenbergs did. We condemn their disloyalty. We condemn them as treasonous traitors. Much of American Jewry stood up and did that. Now, it's an interesting experiment. Just open the pages of the Detroit Jewish News in 1953. That's what most of the things are saying. There are attempts to try to explain it. Well, this is why they did it, but there's a pretty good consensus that they did. But Jewish Life was a publication that was going against the grain here, okay? And basically saying that the tendency of American Jews is simply, wilt and basically go along with all of this and not defend the Rosenbergs, not defend their fellow Jews. This is something akin to the Judenrat. This is like collaborating in the ghettos, which is a very serious accusation. Let me read a little more. As emboldened fascist elements grow more powerful. Now, the emboldened fascist elements, meaning the country's anti-communism is transforming it from a democracy into something more akin to fascism. Rights are being suspended and violated. Okay? As emboldened fascist elements grow more powerful, the American version of the Judenrat becomes bolder in its betrayal. We, who still have it in our hands to keep fascism from developing in our country, can also reject the Judenrat before it becomes the dominant force in the Jewish community. We must reject the blind anti-communist line, reminiscent of Hitlerism, behind which the Judenrat seeks to lead the Jewish people to destruction. Now, what this essay is doing is not condoning what the Rosenbergs did, but focusing rather on the way they were convicted without proper evidence. They're not focusing on the act. They're focusing on the travesty of justice that they believe took place. The way that if there had been clear evidence, if Julius Rosenberg was Klaus Fuchs, who clearly was guilty, or David Greenglass, who clearly was guilty, that would have been one thing. But the point here, and the dilemma for some segments within the American Jewish community is, we want to be seen as patriotic and loyal, but we're also defenders of justice and basic civil rights. And the notion here is the way that trial proceeded, the basic rights of the Rosenbergs had been violated. Their right to a fair trial was set aside because of this raging, feverish anti-communism in this country. Okay? Now, not everyone saw it that way. Let me give you the counterpoint of view, which appeared in Commentary Magazine around the same time. And this is an essay written by Lucy Duvidovitz. Now, Lucy Duvidovitz in 1952 was one of the premier Jewish historians of the 20th century. Anywhere. She was remarkable. She wrote one of the first real comprehensive studies of Jews under Hitler, called Hitler's War Against the Jews. But she also, when she wasn't busy being a historian, she had some very clear political views. She was a staunch anti-communist. So this is what she writes about the Rosenberg case and its implications for anti-Semitism. This is text number 5. Quote, "Communism leads inevitably to anti-Semitism." That's a very loaded statement. And that the Truman administration, by resisting the march of world communism, must thereby develop into a fascist regime. Okay? She doesn't buy that. She's criticizing that notion. That's what the previous essay had said. It is obvious that the communists, by such propaganda, aim to enlist Jews in defense of communists and their interest. But it is equally obvious, or should be, that the communists are also engaged in an insidious campaign, which, if it succeeded, could only serve to establish guilt, though they call it innocence, by false association. Because a spy or a communist is a Jew, the communists proclaim that all Jews are collectively involved. More, the communists take it upon themselves to make this involvement a reality so far as their powers permit, that in the process great danger may be done to American Jews. Far from restraining the communists seems only to encourage them. It is well to be on guard. We have seen how similar campaigns of identification and accusation have strengthened the hands of anti-Semitic forces elsewhere. So she had a little different problem with this. She agreed, yes, the problem here is the travesty of justice. But she didn't see the travesty of justice as something that an anti-communist government was doing. She thinks this whole thing was an insidious communist plot. The whole thing was a setup by communists to discredit anti-communists, and at the same time to win the sympathy and support of Jews for communism, because 2 innocent Jews are going to be convicted. Now, like I said, Lucy Duvidovitz was a great historian, but when she became more of a polemicist, more activist and academic, her one-dimensional understanding of the world became clearer and clearer. Incidentally, there was a great biography written by her, published by Wayne State University Press by Nancy Sinkoff 2 years ago, which is certainly worth reading. Okay? The point being that even before the execution, even once the trial was complete, there were very different views on what the trial meant. And there are very different views on what the significance of 2 Jews convicted of spying meant. And there were different views even within the American Jewish community. What does it mean? What are we to do about it? Now keep in mind also, this is 1952. This is only 7 years, not only after the end of World War II, but also 7 years after the end of the Holocaust. In the mind of some writers and some thinkers in the Jewish community, it was hard to make a clear separation. Some individuals, some thought that the persecution of the Rosenbergs by the government of the United States was simply a natural extension or continuation of the persecution of Jews by Hitler during the war, by Stalin after the war. There was a temptation to reduce this to the endemic nature of anti-Semitism. But that was not a main view. Really, the big question is, A, were they guilty or not? And secondly, what does it mean that even if they were guilty, that the trial clearly was rigged, that they didn't get a fair trial? And that's one of the biggest problems of the whole thing, is that if the trial had been conducted in a way which was less vulnerable to real scrutiny, if the trial really could stand up to scrutiny, a lot of these debates wouldn't have to take place. But it was pretty clear, pretty early on, that certainly Ethel Rosenberg was being railroaded, and that while Julius Rosenberg appeared more guilty, they simply didn't have the evidence against him. I'll give you an example here. The judge presiding over the trial was Jerome Kaufman. Jerome Kaufman, look, he made no secret that he had strong political views. He was a strong anti-communist. And look what in his statement when he was reading the verdict, this is text number 6, this is what he said, quote, "I consider your crimes worse than murder. I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russians, the A-bomb, years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb, has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea, with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000. He blamed the Korean War on the Rosenbergs. A little bit of a stretch, maybe. Indeed, Indeed, by your betrayal, you have undoubtedly altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. I feel that I must pass such sentence upon the principles in this diabolical conspiracy to destroy a God-fearing nation, which will demonstrate with finality that this nation's security must remain inviolate. Sorry for the typo. Love for their children dominated their lives. It was even greater than Love for their children dominated their lives. It was even greater than love for their party dominated their lives. It was even greater than their love for their children. Now look, that statement went far beyond what any evidence showed. Okay? For him, this wasn't simply the arrest and conviction and eventual execution of two spies. This was had much broader implications. What he believed the Rosenbergs had done, the damage that they had single-handedly caused to the United States, went way past simply selling military secrets. He's really blaming a lot on them. And this is a mentality which was very much in sync with the broader mentality of the McCarthy era. So it seems like if the Rosenbergs had been arrested in a different decade, maybe in the 1960s, it might have gone a little bit differently. There are other times where it could have gone worse. But the point is, in this particular moment, the legacy of the Rosenbergs, even though certainly Julius, it's clear that he was a spy. There's no question. But there are larger issues that remain unresolved, that historians and biographers are still trying to unravel. All right? I'll give you an example. Writing after the war, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. This is, full disclosure, this is a French communist, Jean-Paul Sartre, writing after the trial. This is how he described it, text number 7. The trial was a legal lynching which smears with blood a whole nation. By killing the Rosenbergs, you have quite simply tried to halt the progress of science by human sacrifice. Magic, witch hunts, auto-dafes, sacrifices, we are all getting to the point. Your country is sick with fear. You are afraid of the shadow of your own bomb. Basically, he said this had nothing to do with the Rosenbergs specifically, per se. This was about the fear, or it certainly was animated by the fear caused by the fear of communism. The Rosenbergs were simply victims of that larger fear. Okay? I'll give you one other. Leslie Fiedler was a social critic and a literary critic who wrote in the 1960s and the 1970s. There was a point where Leslie Fiedler was like the be-all and end-all of social critics in the United States. And he wrote a book called The End to Innocence. And this is what he wrote about the Rosenbergs in 1972. What irked me when I first wrote about the Rosenbergs was their refusal of candor and heroism, their failure to stand up in court and define just what it was they had done and just what beliefs had prompted their actions. In other words, the Rosenbergs were very, they weren't shouting. They were simply sitting there being bewildered. I like to think that, however, current sentimentality may falsify the actual situation of the Rosenbergs. However current sentimentality may falsify the actual situation of the Rosenbergs, it was precisely such exposures of their cowardice and confusion which makes it possible now in a new age of political oppression for defendants like the Chicago 7, who were put on trial for sedition in 1968, to stand up in court and shout out loud and clear just what they were guilty of, rather than to whimper about their innocence and superior patriotic devotion. What Leslie Fiedler is saying is that one of the legacies learned from the Rosenberg trial, and the fact that they were convicted without any substantial evidence, was that they didn't stand up and vocally defend themselves. They were too quiescent, they were too quiet, they were too passive. They were too much relying on the fact that if there was no clear evidence against them, they wouldn't be convicted, and there would be some recognition that, at least in their own minds, they were acting out of a sense of loyalty to what they considered to be the best interests of the United States. The fact that none of that happened, what Fiedler says is since the Rosenberg trial, the lesson learned is if you are brought to court because of your views, make sure you shout them as loudly and as often as you can. And that's the difference between the Rosenberg trials, where the defendants basically just sat there, and the trial of the Chicago 7, that's like Abby Hoffman. You know, that movie about Abby Hoffman where Sacha Baron Cohen plays an excellent movie, you should definitely see it. But they weren't quiet at all in court. They shouted and defended themselves the entire time because they were setting themselves in contrast to the Rosenbergs. So the larger lesson here, I think the larger takeaway is that the question isn't only whether or not they were guilty. The question is, how do we, in a country, in a system that is based on basic civil rights, what do we do when there is a situation that is frightening, that is terrifying, where we feel the need to act urgently and deliberately and immediately? How do we deal with that fear and that sense of urgency without violating the rights of those we were putting on trial? In other words, the larger takeaway of the Rosenbergs is, and the challenge for cases like this, and for every case since then, the challenge is, how do you bring a perpetrator to trial, even someone terrible, even someone who may actually be posing a threat, how do you do it in a fair and just way? And I think in this sense, the real contrast to the Rosenberg trial, with all the ambivalence it produced, was the Eichmann trial in Israel. You know, the Eichmann trial in Israel took place about 10 years later. No one had any doubt that Eichmann was not only guilty, but he was like Eichmann guilty. He was really guilty, but nonetheless, if you read the transcript of that trial, and remember, he was tried for crimes against humanity and for genocide against the Jews in a court in Jerusalem, and he was given a proper defense. The judges and those adjudicating the cases, they followed the rules of order. He was given a fair trial, even in the state of Israel. That simply didn't seem to be the case with the Rosenbergs. And that's why 50, 60 years later, after the trial ended, 70 years later, there's still debate going on about their actual guilt. Whereas if they had been given a trial which was undoubtedly fair, a lot of that debate would have disappeared. So it leaves us, just to be clear, yes, Julius Rosenberg certainly he did it. But the trial, the way in which they reached that conclusion was not, well, it was not beyond reproach. Now, it also points to the other question I want to answer. Why was there no surge of anti-Jewish violence in the aftermath of the Rosenberg trial? First of all, and here I would contrast the 1950s to the 1960s. In the 1960s, this was a very tumultuous decade. Everyone spoke their views very freely. There was a lot of public activism. In the 1950s, everyone was afraid to move. Everyone was afraid to say anything. And, you know, if you were someone who wanted to organize a pogrom or organize some kind of demonstration or riot against the Rosenbergs, you couldn't be entirely sure in the 1950s if what you were doing could be in some way misconstrued as somehow something communist. There was a general fear of being conspicuous in any way. That, to my mind, it was an element in a sort of ironic way, this tamping down of free speech in all forms during the McCarthy era. It made it more difficult to organize mass public rallies one way or the other. And that's why much of the debate over the Rosenbergs took place in the pages of newspapers as opposed to with large crowds gathered openly and publicly and shouting slogans in the street. It simply wasn't something that was feasible in that age. That, I think, is the complex legacy of the Rosenberg trial. Thank you so much.